The morning briefing at Kandahar Airfield carried an unusual tension. Colonel Martinez stood before the assembled rescue team, his weathered face bearing the weight of impossible decisions. Behind him, satellite imagery flickered across multiple screens, a downed reconnaissance aircraft deep in Taliban-controlled territory, its crew beacon still transmitting after 18 hours of radio silence. "Gentlemen," Martinez began, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, "we have a problem." The room fell silent save for the distant hum of generators and the occasional crack of settling metal in the Afghan heat. Two-man crew from the 160th went down approximately 40 clicks northeast of here. Heavy enemy presence, surface-to-air missile sites confirmed active, weather deteriorating rapidly. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Viper Vasquez sat in the back row, her slight frame almost invisible among the broader shoulders of her male counterparts. At 28, she possessed more combat flight hours than most pilots twice her age, but in rooms like this, she remained perpetually overlooked. Her fingers absently traced the edges of her flight helmet, calloused from countless hours gripping cyclic controls through hostile airspace. "Sir," interrupted Major Thompson, the lead pilot everyone expected would take point on this mission, "what's the timeline for extraction?" Martinez clicked to the next slide. "Weather window closes in 6 hours. After that, we're looking at a 3-day sandstorm that'll ground everything with rotors." The implications hung heavy in the recycled air. 3 days meant death for the downed crew, either from exposure, capture, or the inevitable Taliban reinforcements converging on their position. "Who's primary on this?" Thompson asked, already reaching for his gear. Martinez hesitated, glancing at his notes. "Actually, we have a complication. The landing zone is in a narrow valley, surrounded by peaks exceeding 14,000 feet. High altitude, confined space landing under combat conditions." His eyes swept the room. "We need someone with mountain warfare experience." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Most of the assembled pilots specialized in desert operations, their expertise honed on the flatter terrain surrounding Kandahar. Mountain flying required different skills, an intuitive understanding of air density, rotor wash behavior in thin atmosphere, and the kind of spatial awareness that couldn't be taught in simulators. "Sir," Vasquez spoke quietly from the back, her voice barely audible above the briefing room's ambient noise. Martinez squinted toward her. "Yes, Warrant Officer. I've logged over 300 hours in the Hindu Kush. Night operations, high-altitude insertions, confined LZs." She paused, watching skeptical expressions ripple across the room. "I can get them out." The room erupted in barely contained murmurs. Thompson's jaw tightened visibly. This wasn't how these missions typically went. The unspoken hierarchy of military aviation rarely elevated someone like Vasquez, too young, too female, too quiet, to lead such high-stakes operations. Martinez studied her personnel file on his tablet, his expression unreadable in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Viper, you're saying you can thread a Black Hawk through a mountain valley in deteriorating weather with active SAM sites." His tone carried the weight of command responsibility. "Under fire." Vasquez stood, her posture straightening with quiet confidence. "Yes, sir, I can bring them home." The room remained suspended in disbelief. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the Afghan sky in shades of amber and steel, while somewhere in the mountains, 2 American aircrew waited in the darkness, their lives hanging in the balance of a decision that would either validate or destroy the career of an underestimated pilot whose call sign had been earned in blood and doubt. Martinez closed the file, his decision crystallizing like ice on a windshield. "Gentlemen, meet your primary pilot." The rescue operation that would redefine everything they thought they knew about courage had just begun, and Elena Vasquez stood at its center, carrying the weight of skepticism, expectation, and the unforgiving mathematics of rotor-wing flight in hostile territory, where margins for error measured in heartbeats, and the difference between success and catastrophe, could be found in the steady hands of a pilot nobody had bothered to truly see. Thompson's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a combat rescue, not a training exercise." "Exactly," Martinez replied, his tone final. "Which is why we need the pilot with the most relevant experience, not the most convenient assumptions." The rebuke landed with surgical precision. Around the room, the assembled aircrew began to recognize they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just a mission briefing, but a moment when merit would be measured against prejudice, when the crucible of combat would separate genuine capability from comfortable tradition. Vasquez felt the weight of every stare, every doubt, every unspoken question about her ability to handle what lay ahead. The familiar knot of determination tightened in her chest, the same feeling she'd carried through flight school when instructors questioned her physical strength, through combat deployments when crews initially resisted her leadership, through countless moments when she'd been forced to prove herself worthy of opportunities that seemed to flow effortlessly to others. "Brief me on the specifics," she said, moving toward the front of the room with measured steps. "Weather patterns, enemy disposition, approach vectors." Martinez activated the tactical display, and the room transformed into a digital battlefield. Topographical lines painted the complexity of the terrain, jagged peaks, narrow valleys, and the tiny clearing where two Americans waited for rescue. Red markers indicated known enemy positions, while amber zones showed probable threats. "Intel suggests at least two SA-7 sites here and here." Martinez pointed to positions flanking the valley entrance. "Mobile patrols throughout the area, estimated company-strength Taliban forces converging on the crash site." Vasquez studied the display with the intensity of a surgeon examining patient charts. Her mind automatically began calculating approach angles, considering how rotor wash would behave in the confined space, weighing the risks of different ingress and egress routes. Time to target. 90 minutes flight time, allowing for terrain masking and threat avoidance. She nodded, already visualizing the mission profile. "I'll need my usual crew chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, and I want Specialist Chen on the gun." "Done." Martinez's quick agreement surprised the room. "Anything else?" "Just the understanding that when I bring them home, the conversation about female pilots in combat roles ends permanently." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, direct and uncompromising. This wasn't just about rescuing two downed aircrew. It was about proving that competence transcended gender, that the sky recognized only skill and determination, not the arbitrary limitations imposed by ground-bound thinking. Major Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Viper, nobody's questioning your—" "Yes, you are," she interrupted, her voice steady but edged with steel. "And that's fine, I'm used to it, but understand this. Those men out there don't care about my gender. They care about getting home alive, and I'm the pilot who's going to make that happen." The briefing room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the assembled personnel like dust after an explosion. Outside, the Afghan morning continued its relentless advance, and somewhere in the mountains, time was running out for two American aircrew whose rescue now depended on a pilot whose entire career had been defined by exceeding expectations that had been set deliberately low. Martinez checked his watch, the gesture carrying the finality of countdown timers. "Wheels up in 30 minutes. Weather window is non-negotiable." As the room began to empty, pilots and crew chiefs moving toward their aircraft with the purposeful urgency of combat operations, Vasquez remained behind, studying the tactical display with the focused intensity that had defined her approach to every challenge she'd faced. The mountains stared back from the screen, their digital representation failing to capture the brutal reality of thin air, unpredictable winds, and the kind of terrain that had claimed aircraft and crews with ruthless efficiency. But Alina Vasquez had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones that appeared most impossible to defeat. The mountains would test her flying skills, The Taliban would test her tactical judgment, and the mission would test her ability to perform under pressure that could shatter careers and end lives. Rodriguez appeared at her shoulder, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ma'am, birds pre-flighted and ready. Chen's got the minigun locked and loaded." She turned from the display, her expression shifting from analytical to operational. "Good. And Rodriguez?" "Yes, ma'am. Today we make history, one way or another." The crew chief's grin was answer enough. They'd flown together through 3 deployments, survived countless missions that had tested the limits of aircraft and crew, and developed the kind of trust that could only be forged in the crucible of combat operations, where mistakes measured in milliseconds could mean the difference between coming home and becoming another casualty statistic. The walk to their aircraft carried the weight of ceremony. Other crews paused in their preparations to watch, their expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity to something approaching respect. Word traveled fast in military aviation. Everyone knew this wasn't just another rescue mission, but a proving ground where assumptions would be tested against the unforgiving reality of combat. The Black Hawk sat on the tarmac like a predator, its rotor blades drooping in the morning heat, weapon systems bristling with lethal efficiency. Vasquez approached her aircraft with the reverence of a warrior greeting a trusted weapon, her hands automatically checking control surfaces, weapon mounts, and the thousand small details that separated successful missions from memorial services. "Ma'am," Chen called from the cargo bay, "comm check complete. We're linked with TOC and the forward air controller." She nodded, settling into the pilot's seat with the familiar comfort of coming home. The cockpit enveloped her like a second skin, every switch and indicator positioned exactly where muscle memory expected, every system humming with the quiet efficiency of American military engineering. "Rodriguez, give me a final systems check." Engines green, hydraulics nominal, all weapon systems armed and ready. Through the windscreen, she could see other aircraft preparing for the day's operations. Apache gunships, transport helicopters, the constant ballet of military aviation that kept the war machine functioning. But today, her aircraft would carry the weight of something more than routine missions. The radio crackled to life, Martinez's voice cutting through the static. "Viper, this is TOC. You have final clearance for dust-off. Bring them home." "TOC, Viper, understand final clearance. We'll get them out." The engines spooled up with increasing urgency, rotor blades beginning their lazy rotation that would soon become a blur of mechanical precision. Around the aircraft, ground crews cleared the area with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated through thousands of repetitions of the same deadly dance. Elena Vasquez felt the familiar transformation as pilot and machine became one entity, her consciousness expanding to encompass rotor disk, engine parameters, and the infinite variables of powered flight. This was where she belonged, not in briefing rooms defending her qualifications, but in the cockpit where skill mattered more than prejudice, where the only opinions that counted were those of physics, aerodynamics, and the enemy waiting in the mountains. The Black Hawk lifted off with the deliberate grace of a predator taking flight, its shadow racing across the tarmac as Afghanistan fell away beneath them. Behind them, Kandahar Airfield continued its routine operations, but ahead lay the kind of challenge that would either confirm Elena Vasquez as one of the finest combat pilots of her generation, or add her name to the growing list of those who had tested themselves against the mountains and found the margin for error smaller than their courage. The mission that would redefine everything had begun, and in the cockpit of a Black Hawk helicopter racing toward the Hindu Kush, a pilot whose career had been built on exceeding expectations, prepared to face the ultimate test of skill, determination, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in flight school or measured in performance evaluations. The radio crackled with updates from the Tactical Operations Center, painting a picture of deteriorating conditions at the crash site. Enemy forces were tightening their perimeter, Weather was building faster than predicted, and the two downed aircrew were running out of time in a landscape that showed no mercy to the wounded or the weak. Elena Vasquez flew toward the mountains with the steady confidence of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, when all the doubts and challenges would be resolved in the clarity of combat, where the only measurement that mattered was bringing Americans home alive. The helicopter's shadow raced across the desert floor, chasing the sun toward a confrontation that would test everything she believed about herself, everything she'd fought to prove, and everything that separated competent pilots from legends whose names would be remembered long after the last shots of this war had been fired. In the crew compartment, Rodriguez and Chen made final preparations, their movements economical and professional. They'd flown with Vasquez long enough to trust her judgment, to understand that beneath the quiet exterior lay the kind of pilot who could thread aircraft through impossible spaces, who could make decisions under pressure that would save lives when others might hesitate. The mountains grew larger on the horizon, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that promised the kind of weather that grounded lesser pilots and turned routine missions into survivable disasters. But Elena Vasquez had learned to read the sky like a text, to understand the subtle signs that differentiated dangerous conditions from merely challenging ones. "Ma'am," Rodriguez's voice carried over the intercom, "we're approaching the edge of the no-fly zone. Rules of engagement are weapons-free once we cross the line." She acknowledged with a brief key of the radio, her attention focused on the terrain ahead. The landscape was beginning its transformation from desert to foothills, the gentle rises that would soon become the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush. This was where the real test would begin, not in the safety of Kandahar airfield, but in the thin air and unpredictable winds of high-altitude combat operations. The weather was deteriorating faster than predicted, clouds building, with the ominous efficiency of mountain storms that could turn clear skies into zero visibility in minutes. But ahead, somewhere in those mountains, two American aircrew waited for rescue, their lives dependent on the skill and determination of a pilot whose entire career had been preparation for this moment. Elena Vasquez flew toward the mountains with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years proving herself in a profession that had never welcomed her easily, who had learned to excel not because the path was smooth, but because the alternative was unacceptable. The rescue that would define her legacy had begun, and she was ready. The radio crackled with the first reports from the forward air controller, painting a picture of the battlefield that waited ahead. Enemy movement was increasing, weather was closing in, and the clock was running out for two Americans whose only hope lay in the hands of a pilot whose call sign had been earned through competence, courage, and the kind of determination that couldn't be taught, but only forged in the crucible of combat. The Black Hawk flew toward the mountains, carrying with it the weight of expectations, the burden of proof, and the simple, uncompromising mission to bring Americans home alive. In the cockpit, Elena Vasquez prepared for the challenge that would either validate everything she'd fought to prove or become the defining failure of a career built on exceeding impossible standards. The mountains waited ahead, indifferent to human ambition, caring nothing for gender politics or career advancement, recognizing only the eternal calculus of pilot skill versus natural law. And in that approaching crucible, Elena Vasquez would discover whether years of preparation had been enough to master the kind of challenge that separated competent aviators from the legends whose names would be remembered long after the war had ended. The aircraft's shadow raced across increasingly broken terrain, chasing the sun toward a confrontation with mountains, weather, and enemy forces that would test every skill Elena Vasquez had developed, every lesson she'd learned, and every assumption about what it meant to be a combat pilot in the 21st century. The mission that would redefine everything had begun, and there was no turning back. Rodriguez's voice cut through the engine noise, professional and calm. "Ma'am, we're 30 minutes from the target area. Weather's building fast. visibility dropping to about 2 miles and decreasing. Elena Vasquez keyed her radio, the familiar weight of command settling over her shoulders. "Copy that. Chen, how's our defensive posture?" "Miniguns hot, chaff and flare dispensers loaded. I've got eyes on the terrain looking for threats." The landscape below was transforming, desert giving way to the foothills that marked the beginning of the Hindu Kush. She could see the first wisps of cloud clinging to the higher peaks, the atmospheric disturbances that would soon turn routine flight into a test of skill and nerve. "TOC, this is Viper," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "We're approaching the target area, requesting final intelligence update." "Viper, TOC. Enemy activity has increased in the last 30 minutes. We're tracking multiple vehicles converging on the crash site. Estimated time until they reach the survivors is 45 minutes. The mathematics were becoming stark. She had to navigate mountain terrain, avoid enemy fire, land in a confined space under combat conditions, extract 2 wounded aircrew, and escape before Taliban forces could overwhelm the position. The margin for error was shrinking with each passing minute. "Understood, TOC. We'll be on station in 15 minutes." The radio clicked off, leaving her alone with the sound of rotor blades and the weight of approaching decisions. Through the windscreen, she could see the mountains growing larger, their peaks disappearing into clouds that promised the kind of weather that could ground aircraft and doom rescue attempts. But Elena Vasquez had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this. Every training flight, every combat mission, every challenge she'd faced had been preparation for the kind of test that would either validate her place among the elite of military aviation or demonstrate the limitations that skeptics had always claimed existed. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of concern. "Ma'am, I'm seeing weather moving in faster than forecast. We might have a very narrow window." She studied the approaching storm system, her mind automatically calculating wind patterns, visibility limitations, and the kind of atmospheric conditions that could turn controlled flight into a barely managed emergency. The weather was becoming a factor, but not yet a limiting one. "We'll make it work," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. "We didn't come this far to turn back because of weather." The forward air controller's voice crackled over the radio, providing the first real-time intelligence from the battlefield. "Viper, this is Falcon. I've got eyes on the crash site. 2 survivors, both mobile but wounded. Enemy forces are approximately 1 click northeast and closing." "Falcon Viper, what's the terrain like around the LZ?" "Narrow valley, rocky terrain, limited approach options. You'll need to come in from the southwest to avoid the higher peaks. Winds gusting to 30 knots down the valley." Elena absorbed the information, her mind automatically adjusting the mission profile. A narrow valley meant limited maneuvering space, while gusting winds would make the approach more challenging. But she'd trained for exactly these conditions, had logged hundreds of hours in mountain terrain that most pilots avoided. "Copy that, Falcon. We'll be on station in 10 minutes." Chen's voice carried over the intercom, tense but professional. "Ma'am, I've got movement on the ground. Looks like a vehicle column, about 5 miles northeast of the crash site." Through her helmet-mounted display, she could see the thermal signatures that Chen was tracking, vehicles moving with the purposeful efficiency of military forces converging on a target. The Taliban were closing in, and time was running out. "How many vehicles?" "Looks like 3, maybe 4. Hard to tell with the terrain masking." The tactical situation was becoming more complex. She'd have to extract the survivors before enemy forces could establish a perimeter, which meant landing in a confined space under potential fire while maintaining the kind of precision that mountain flying demanded. "Rodriguez, give me a weapons check." "All systems green, ma'am. We're ready for whatever's waiting." The confidence in his voice was reassuring. Rodriguez had been with her through 3 deployments, had seen her handle situations that would have challenged more experienced pilots. His faith in her ability was worth more than any official endorsement. The mountains were now dominating the horizon, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised difficult flying conditions. But Alina Vasquez had learned to read mountain weather, to understand the subtle signs that distinguished challenging conditions from impossible ones. The weather was deteriorating, but it was still flyable, barely. "Ma'am," Rodriguez called out, "I'm seeing the valley entrance. Looks like the briefing photos were accurate." Through the windscreen, she could see the narrow opening between 2 massive peaks, the kind of terrain feature that required precise navigation and steady nerves. One mistake in positioning could result in controlled flight into terrain, military aviation's euphemism for flying into a mountain. "Falcon, this is Viper. I have visual on the valley entrance. What's the current situation at the crash site?" "Viper Falcon. Survivors are in position, ready for extraction. Enemy forces are still inbound but haven't reached the perimeter yet. Weather's deteriorating rapidly, visibility dropping fast." The window of opportunity was narrowing. She had to thread the aircraft through the valley, avoid enemy fire, land in a confined space, extract 2 wounded aircrew, and escape before the weather made flight impossible or enemy forces could establish an effective perimeter. Alina Vasquez felt the familiar calm that settled over her in moments of extreme challenge. This was where she belonged, not in briefing rooms defending her qualifications, but in the cockpit where skill mattered more than prejudice, where the laws of physics and aerodynamics were the only judges that counted. Chen, Rodriguez were going in. Stay alert for threats and be ready to suppress any enemy fire. "Copy that, ma'am. We're ready." The Black Hawk entered the valley with the deliberate precision of a surgeon's scalpel, Alina's hands steady on the controls as she navigated between towering peaks that seemed to close in around the aircraft. The terrain was even more challenging than the briefing photos had suggested: jagged rock faces, unpredictable wind patterns, and the kind of confined space that left no margin for error. But this was why she'd spent years mastering mountain flying, why she'd logged more high-altitude hours than most pilots would see in an entire career. The valley was dangerous, but it was also familiar territory for someone who had made a career of exceeding expectations in impossible circumstances. The radio crackled with updates from the forward air controller, painting a picture of a situation that was becoming more urgent with each passing minute. Enemy forces were closing in, weather was deteriorating, and 2 American aircrew were running out of time in a landscape that showed no mercy to the wounded or the weak. Alina Vasquez flew deeper into the valley, her aircraft threading between peaks with the precision of a needle through cloth, carrying with it the weight of expectations, the burden of proof, and the simple, uncompromising mission to bring Americans home alive. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a cathedral, their peaks disappearing into clouds that promised the kind of weather that could ground aircraft and doom rescue attempts. But ahead, somewhere in this maze of rock and wind, 2 Americans waited for rescue, their lives dependent on the skill and determination of a pilot whose entire career had been preparation for this moment. The rescue that would define everything had begun, and there was no turning back. "Ma'am," Rodriguez's voice carried a note of urgency, "I'm seeing muzzle flashes on the ridge line to our east. We're taking fire." The first rounds cracked past the aircraft, their distinctive sound cutting through the rotor noise like a deadly percussion section. Alina Vasquez felt the familiar adrenaline surge that accompanied combat, her mind automatically shifting into the heightened awareness that combat pilots called the zone, where time seemed to slow, and every decision carried the weight of life and death. "Chen, can you identify the source?" "Working on it, ma'am. Looks like small arms fire from multiple positions. I'm engaging now." The minigun's distinctive whine filled the aircraft as Chen began suppressing the enemy positions, his tracers reaching out toward the muzzle flashes with the precise lethality of American military training. The enemy fire decreased, but didn't stop entirely. They were committed to preventing the rescue. Falcon, this is Viper. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Can you provide support? Viper Falcon. I'm calling in fast movers, but they're 10 minutes out. You'll have to handle the immediate threat. 10 minutes was a lifetime in combat aviation. Elena Vasquez knew she couldn't wait for air support. The survivors needed extraction now, before enemy forces could establish a perimeter that would make rescue impossible. Copy that, Falcon. We're proceeding to the LZ. The aircraft bucked slightly as enemy rounds found their mark, but the Black Hawk's robust construction absorbed the damage without affecting flight characteristics. Rodriguez's voice carried over the intercom, professional despite the circumstances. Ma'am, we've got some minor damage to the fuselage, but all systems are still green. We're good to continue. Elena banked the aircraft toward the crash site, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain for threats while maintaining the precise control that mountain flying demanded. The valley was narrowing, forcing her to maintain a flight path that left little room for evasive maneuvering. There, Chen called out, his voice cutting through the noise. I've got eyes on the survivors. 2 o'clock, about 200 meters. Through the windscreen, she could see them. 2 figures in flight suits, one supporting the other, both moving toward what looked like a small clearing barely large enough for a helicopter landing. The landing zone was more challenging than the briefing photos had suggested, surrounded by boulders and sloping terrain that would make a precision approach mandatory. Falcon, this is Viper. I have visual on the survivors, beginning approach to the LZ. Copy, Viper. Be advised, enemy forces are approximately 500 meters from the crash site and closing rapidly. The tactical situation was becoming desperate. She had to land in a confined space under fire, extract 2 wounded aircrew, and escape before enemy forces could overwhelm the position. The margin for error was essentially zero. Elena Vasquez began her approach with the methodical precision that had become her trademark, her hands steady on the controls as she maneuvered the aircraft through the complex aerial geometry that mountain flying demanded. The wind was gusting unpredictably, causing the aircraft to buck and shift as she fought to maintain precise control. Ma'am, Rodriguez called out, I'm seeing more enemy movement to the north. Looks like they're trying to flank the LZ. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were closing from multiple directions. Weather was making flight increasingly dangerous, and she had to land in a space that challenged the limits of aircraft and pilot capability. But Elena Vasquez had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this. Every training flight, every combat mission, every challenge she'd faced had been preparation for the kind of test that would either validate her place among the elite of military aviation or demonstrate the limitations that skeptics had always claimed existed. Chen, keep those flanking positions suppressed. Rodriguez, be ready for a fast extraction. Copy that, ma'am. We're ready. The Black Hawk descended toward the landing zone with the deliberate precision of a predator stalking prey. Elena's hands steady on the controls as she fought wind, terrain, and enemy fire to position the aircraft for what might be the most challenging landing of her career. The survivors were visible now, crouched behind a boulder formation that provided minimal cover from enemy fire. One was clearly wounded, his flight suit dark with blood, while the other maintained a defensive posture with his sidearm drawn. They were professional aircrew, maintaining discipline despite circumstances that would have broken lesser men. 30 seconds to touchdown, she announced, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. The approach required every skill she'd developed over years of mountain flying, precise power control, constant adjustment for wind and terrain, and the kind of spatial awareness that couldn't be taught in simulators. One mistake would result in controlled flight into terrain, ending not just her career but the lives of everyone aboard. Enemy fire was increasing as Taliban forces realized what was happening. Rounds cracked past the aircraft with increasing frequency, some finding their mark on the fuselage but not yet affecting critical systems. Chen's return fire was accurate and sustained, keeping enemy heads down during the most vulnerable phase of the approach. 20 seconds, Alina announced, her hands making constant small adjustments to maintain precise control in the gusting wind. The landing zone was even more challenging than it had appeared from altitude: rocky terrain, limited flat space, and surrounded by obstacles that would make a normal approach impossible. But Alina Vasquez had built her career on making impossible landings, on finding solutions when others saw only obstacles. 10 seconds. Rodriguez, be ready to get them aboard fast. Copy that, ma'am. I'm ready. The aircraft touched down with the gentle precision of a butterfly landing on a flower, Alina's years of experience allowing her to compensate for wind, terrain, and the constant threat of enemy fire. The survivors were already moving toward the aircraft, the wounded man supported by his crew member in a display of the brotherhood that defined military aviation. Loading now, Rodriguez called out, his voice professional despite the bullets cracking overhead. Alina kept the aircraft in a hover barely a foot above the ground, her hands constantly adjusting for the wind and terrain that made this one of the most challenging landings of her career. Every instinct told her to get airborne immediately, but she forced herself to wait until both survivors were safely aboard. Both survivors on board, Rodriguez announced. Medical aid being administered. We're ready for departure. Copy that, we're getting out of here. The Black Hawk lifted off with the urgent grace of an aircraft and pilot pushed to their limits, Alina's hands steady on the controls as she began the complex process of extracting from terrain that left no margin for error. Enemy fire was increasing, but they were airborne and accelerating toward the valley entrance. Ma'am, Chen called out, I'm seeing vehicle lights on the valley floor. Looks like enemy reinforcements arriving. Through the windscreen, she could see the headlights of vehicles racing toward the crash site, their arrival timed with military precision. The Taliban had been closer than intelligence estimated, and the rescue window had been even narrower than anyone had realized. Falcon, this is Viper. We have both survivors aboard and are departing the LZ. Enemy forces are arriving at the crash site now. Outstanding work, Viper. You got them out with about 30 seconds to spare. The understatement was typical of military communication, but Alina Vasquez understood the reality. They had executed a rescue that challenged the limits of aircraft and crew capability, succeeding where failure would have meant not just mission failure but the loss of American lives. The aircraft climbed toward the valley entrance, fighting wind and weather that seemed determined to prevent their escape. But they were airborne, both survivors were aboard, and the most challenging phase of the mission was complete. Ma'am, Rodriguez's voice carried a note of pride, both survivors are stable. The wounded man has taken a round through the shoulder, but he's conscious and alert. They're both asking to thank you personally. Alina Vasquez felt a surge of emotion that she carefully controlled. This was what it was all about, not the politics of military aviation, not the questions about female pilots in combat roles, but the simple mission of bringing Americans home alive. Tell them they can thank me when we're back at Kandahar, she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. The Black Hawk emerged from the valley into clearer weather, the peaks falling away behind them as they climbed towards safer airspace. The rescue was complete, but the mission wouldn't be over until they were back on friendly territory. TOC, this is Viper. We have both survivors aboard and are departing the area. ETA Kandahar in 60 minutes. Copy that, Viper. Outstanding work. Be advised you have fighter escort inbound for the return flight. Through the windscreen, she could see the contrails of F-16s moving to intercept them, the Air Force's way of ensuring the rescue aircraft made it home safely. The sight was reassuring. American military power deployed to protect a single helicopter carrying 2 rescued aircrew. The return flight gave Elena Vasquez time to reflect on what had just happened. In the span of 90 minutes, she had navigated through mountain terrain that challenged the limits of aircraft performance, landed in a confined space under enemy fire, extracted 2 wounded aircrew, and escaped before enemy forces could prevent the rescue. But more than that, she had proven something that had been questioned throughout her career, that skill and determination mattered more than gender, that the sky recognized only competence and courage, not the arbitrary limitations imposed by those who had never tested themselves in the crucible of combat. "Ma'am," Rodriguez's voice carried over the intercom, "I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. That landing was impossible, but you made it look routine." The compliment meant more than any official commendation. Rodriguez had seen the best military aviation had to offer, had flown with pilots whose names were legends in the community. His assessment carried the weight of experience and professional judgment. "We all did our jobs," she replied, deflecting the praise with the modesty that had become her trademark. "Chen kept the enemy suppressed. You got the survivors aboard and I just flew the aircraft." But she knew it had been more than just flying. It had been the culmination of years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible in military aviation. The rescue had been successful because every member of the crew had performed beyond their normal capabilities. The F-16s formed up alongside them, their pilots' voices crackling over the radio with congratulations and professional respect. Word of the rescue was already spreading through the military aviation community, carried by the informal networks that connected pilots across service branches and specialties. "Viper, this is Falcon 1. Hell of a job in there. We watched the whole thing on our targeting pods." "Thanks, Falcon. Just doing what we trained for." But she knew it had been more than training. It had been the kind of mission that separated competent pilots from the legends, whose names would be remembered long after their flying days were over. The rescue had succeeded because she had been willing to push herself and her aircraft beyond normal limits. The landscape below was gradually changing from the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush to the flatter terrain surrounding Kandahar airfield. The familiar brown expanse of the desert was a welcome sight after the claustrophobic confines of the mountain valley. "Ma'am," Chen called out, "I'm seeing Kandahar on the horizon. We're almost home." Home. The word carried special meaning for military aviators deployed in hostile territory, representing not just a physical destination, but a return to safety after testing themselves against the limits of human and mechanical capability. Elena Vasquez felt the familiar relief that came with successful mission completion, but she also understood that something fundamental had changed during the rescue. "TOC, this is Viper. We're 10 minutes out with 2 survivors aboard, requesting priority landing and medical support." "Copy, Viper. Medical team is standing by. You're cleared for immediate approach to the medical pad." The radio traffic carried an unusual tone of respect, as if word of the rescue had already spread through the base's communication networks. Elena knew that military bases were small communities where news traveled fast, especially when it involved successful operations under challenging conditions. "Ma'am," Rodriguez's voice carried a note of observation, "looks like we've got a crowd waiting for us." Through the windscreen, she could see the medical pad surrounded by more personnel than a routine medical evacuation would normally attract. Word of the rescue had indeed spread, and the base population was turning out to witness the return of an aircraft that had accomplished something extraordinary. The approach to Kandahar airfield was routine after the challenges of mountain flying, but Alina maintained the same level of precision that had characterized the entire mission. The aircraft touched down with the gentle contact that had become her trademark, rotors still turning as medical personnel rushed toward the aircraft. "Both survivors are being offloaded," Rodriguez announced. "Medical team has them stabilized and is moving them to the field hospital." Alina watched through her side window as the two aircrew she had rescued were carefully transferred to stretchers, their faces showing the exhaustion and relief of men who had faced death and survived. The wounded pilot caught her eye through the windscreen and raised his hand in a weak salute, a gesture of gratitude that carried more weight than any official recognition. "Ma'am," Chen called out, "Colonel Martinez is approaching the aircraft." She could see the base commander walking toward them, his expression unreadable in the harsh desert sunlight. This was the moment when the mission's success would be officially acknowledged, when the doubts and questions that had surrounded her selection for the rescue would be resolved. Alina shut down the aircraft with the methodical precision that had characterized every aspect of her flying career, her hands moving through the familiar sequence of switches and controls that transformed the Black Hawk from a living machine to a collection of metal and electronics. The silence that followed the engine shutdown was profound after hours of rotor noise and radio traffic. Martinez approached the aircraft as the crew disembarked, his weathered face showing the kind of expression that senior officers wore when they had witnessed something that exceeded their expectations. He stopped in front of Alina, his posture carrying the formality of military protocol, but his eyes showing genuine respect. "Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez," he began, his voice carrying across the flight line, "I've been flying for 25 years, and I've never seen a rescue executed under more challenging conditions. Your performance today was exceptional." The words carried weight because they came from someone whose opinion mattered in the military aviation community. Martinez had commanded rescue operations throughout the Middle East, had seen the best military aviation had to offer, and his assessment would carry throughout the chain of command. "Thank you, sir. My crew performed exceptionally under difficult conditions." "Yes, they did. But you were the pilot who made the impossible landing, who navigated terrain that would have challenged anyone, who brought two Americans home alive when failure would have meant their deaths." Around them, the assembled personnel listened with the kind of attention that military audiences reserved for moments of historical significance. Alina realized that she was standing at the center of something that would become legend in military aviation circles, the rescue that had proven definitively that skill and courage transcended gender. "Ma'am," Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying the pride of a professional who had witnessed excellence, "I've flown with a lot of pilots, but I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You made the impossible look routine." The assessment carried special weight because Rodriguez had seen the best military aviation had to offer, had flown with pilots whose names were legends in the community. His professional judgment was respected throughout the aviation community. Chen nodded his agreement, his usual reserved demeanor giving way to something approaching awe. "Ma'am, I watched you thread that aircraft through terrain that shouldn't have been flyable, land in a space that was barely large enough for the rotor disc, and extract those men under fire. It was incredible." Alina felt the weight of their praise, understanding that it represented more than just professional recognition. It was validation of everything she had worked to prove throughout her career, that competence and courage were not determined by gender, that the sky recognized only skill and determination. "Sir," she addressed Martinez, "I understand that my selection for this mission was controversial. I hope that today's results will help settle that question." Martinez's expression shifted to something approaching paternal pride. "Warrant Officer Vasquez, there is no question anymore. What you accomplished today will be studied in flight schools for years to come. You've set a new standard for combat rescue operations." The assessment was more than personal vindication. It was recognition that the barriers that had limited opportunities for female pilots in combat roles had been permanently broken. Alina understood that her success would open doors for others, that young women entering military aviation would face fewer doubts and challenges because of what had been proven today. "If I may ask, sir," she said, her voice carrying the confidence that came with successful mission completion, "what's the status of the survivors?" "Both are stable. The wounded man will be evacuated to Germany for surgery, but he's expected to make a full recovery. They're both asking to speak with you personally. They want to thank the pilot who saved their lives." The request carried emotional weight that Alina felt deeply. These were professional aircrew who understood the challenges of military aviation, who recognized the skill and courage that had been required to extract them from circumstances that could have easily resulted in their deaths. "I'd be honored to speak with them, sir." There in the field hospital, the medical team says they're stable enough for visitors. The walk to the field hospital carried the weight of ceremony, with base personnel stopping their activities to watch the pilot whose rescue had already become legend. Alina understood that she was experiencing something that few military aviators ever achieved, the moment when professional competence became historic accomplishment. The field hospital was a controlled environment of medical efficiency, where the controlled chaos of trauma treatment gave way to the quiet professionalism of stabilized patients. Alina found the two aircrew in adjacent beds, their faces showing the exhaustion and relief of men who had faced death and survived. "Ma'am," the wounded pilot said, attempting to sit up despite his shoulder wound, "I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, and this is Major David Chen. We owe you our lives." The formality of the introduction carried weight because it came from senior officers who understood the military aviation community, who recognized exceptional performance when they witnessed it. Their gratitude was professional acknowledgement of the highest order. "I'm just glad we got you out safely," Alina replied, her voice carrying the modesty that had become her trademark. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been shot," Morrison replied with the dark humor that characterized military aircrew, "but alive thanks to you. That landing was impossible. The terrain, the weather, the enemy fire. I've never seen anything like it." Chen nodded his agreement, his voice carrying the assessment of a professional aviator. "Ma'am, I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen a pilot handle conditions like that. You made the impossible look routine." The praise carried special weight because it came from peers who understood the challenges of military aviation, who recognized the skill and courage that had been required to execute the rescue. Their professional judgment would carry throughout the aviation community. "The important thing is that you're both safe," Alina said, deflecting the praise with characteristic modesty. "That's what we came to do." But she understood that the rescue had been more than just a successful mission. It had been proof that the barriers limiting opportunities for female pilots in combat roles were based on assumption rather than reality, that skill and determination mattered more than gender in the unforgiving environment of military aviation. Morrison's expression grew serious, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed something extraordinary. "Ma'am, I want you to know that what you did today will be remembered, not just by us but by everyone who hears about it. You've changed something important." The assessment carried profound meaning because it came from someone whose opinion mattered in the military aviation community. Morrison was a senior officer whose professional judgment was respected throughout the chain of command. "I just did my job," Alina replied, but she understood that it had been more than routine duty. It had been the culmination of years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible in military aviation. "No," Chen said, his voice carrying certainty. "You did something that will be studied and remembered for years to come. You proved that excellence has no gender, that the sky recognizes only competence and courage. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Martinez, whose expression carried the kind of news that senior officers delivered when they had witnessed something that exceeded normal expectations. He approached Elena with the formality of military protocol. "Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez, I've just received word from higher command. Your rescue today has been classified as an exceptional achievement. You're being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross." The decoration was one of the highest honors that could be awarded to military aviators, reserved for those who had demonstrated extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. Alina felt the weight of the recognition, understanding that it represented more than personal achievement. It was validation of everything she had worked to prove throughout her career. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored." "You should be," Martinez replied, his voice carrying the respect of a senior officer who had witnessed something extraordinary. "What you accomplished today will be remembered as one of the finest examples of combat rescue in recent military history." The assessment carried weight because it came from someone whose opinion mattered in the military aviation community. Martinez had commanded rescue operations throughout the Middle East, had seen the best military aviation had to offer, and his professional judgment was respected throughout the chain of command. As Alina left the field hospital, she was accompanied by Rodriguez and Chen, her crew members who had witnessed the rescue and understood its significance. Their presence was a reminder that successful military operations were team efforts, that individual achievement was built on the foundation of professional competence across all crew positions. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said as they walked toward the crew quarters, "I've been thinking about what happened today. You didn't just save 2 lives, you changed something important about how people think about military aviation." The observation carried weight because it came from someone who had witnessed the rescue firsthand, who understood the challenges that had been overcome and the significance of the achievement. Rodriguez had seen the best military aviation had to offer, and his assessment mattered. "I hope so," Alina replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. "If today's mission helps other women get the opportunities they deserve, then it was worth more than just the rescue." Chen nodded his agreement, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had witnessed something extraordinary. "Ma'am, I guarantee that what you did today will be talked about for years to come. You've set a new standard for combat rescue operations." The assessment was more than personal vindication. It was recognition that the barriers that had limited opportunities for female pilots in combat roles had been permanently broken. Alina understood that her success would open doors for others, that young women entering military aviation would face fewer doubts and challenges because of what had been proven today. That evening, as Alina sat in her quarters writing the after-action report that would document the rescue for official records, she reflected on the day's events. The mission had been successful beyond any reasonable expectation, but more importantly, it had proven something that had been questioned throughout her career. The rescue had demonstrated that skill and determination mattered more than gender in military aviation, that the sky recognized only competence and courage, not the arbitrary limitations imposed by those who had never tested themselves in the crucible of combat. The impossible landing had been made possible by years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible. But Alina also understood that the rescue represented more than personal achievement. It was proof that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, that the military's most challenging missions could be accomplished by those who had been underestimated and overlooked. The rescue had changed something fundamental about how military aviation viewed the capabilities of female pilots. As she completed the report, Alina thought about the 2 aircrew she had rescued, now recovering in the field hospital. They represented the ultimate validation of her career, American servicemen who were alive because she had been willing to push herself and her aircraft beyond normal limits, to attempt what others had considered impossible. The rescue that had defined her career was complete, but Alina Vasquez understood that its impact would continue long after the official reports had been filed and the decorations had been awarded. She had proven that the sky recognized only skill and courage, that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that the barriers limiting opportunities for female pilots in combat roles were based on assumption rather than reality. The mission that had started with skepticism and doubt had ended with validation and respect. Alina Vasquez had not just rescued two American aircrew, she had changed something fundamental about military aviation, proving that competence and courage transcended gender, that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. In the months that followed, the rescue would become legend in military aviation circles, studied in flight schools and discussed in crew lounges throughout the military. Young women entering military aviation would hear the story of Alina Viper Vasquez, the pilot who had made the impossible landing and changed forever how the military viewed the capabilities of female aviators. But for now, Alina sat in her quarters, the completed after-action report in front of her, knowing that she had accomplished something that would be remembered long after her flying days were over. The rescue had been successful, the mission complete, and the proof undeniable that excellence knew no gender in the unforgiving sky of military aviation. The story of the rescue would spread through military aviation like wildfire, carried by the informal networks that connected pilots across service branches and specialties. In crew lounges and flight schools, in command centers and maintenance hangars, the tale of Alina Vasquez and her impossible landing would be told and retold, each telling adding to the legend of the pilot who had changed everything. Within weeks, the rescue would be featured in military aviation publications, analyzed in professional journals, and incorporated into training curricula throughout the military. The tactical aspects of the mission would be studied for their technical excellence, but the broader impact would be felt in the changing attitudes toward female pilots in combat roles. Alina understood that she had become something she had never sought to be, a symbol of what was possible when skill and determination were allowed to transcend artificial limitations. The rescue had proven that the sky recognized only competence and courage, that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected sources. But she also knew that the real victory was not the personal recognition or the historical significance of the mission. The real victory was the knowledge that two American aircrew were alive because she had been willing to push herself and her aircraft beyond normal limits, to attempt what others had considered impossible. As she prepared for sleep, Alina thought about the young women who would enter military aviation in the years to come, who would benefit from the doors that had been opened by her successful rescue. They would face fewer doubts and challenges, would be judged more quickly on their competence rather than their gender, would have opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. The rescue had been about more than just bringing two Americans home alive. It had been about proving that excellence knew no gender, that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Alina Vasquez had not just accomplished a successful mission, she had changed the future of military aviation for all the women who would follow in her contrails. The impossible landing had become possible through years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible. But more than that, it had become proof that the barriers limiting opportunities for female pilots in combat roles were based on assumption rather than reality. As Alina drifted off to sleep, she carried with her the satisfaction of mission accomplished, the knowledge that she had proven something important about the nature of excellence in military aviation. The rescue was complete, the mission successful, and the proof undeniable that competence and courage transcended gender in the unforgiving sky where only skill and determination mattered. The legacy of the rescue would continue long after Elena Vasquez had retired from military aviation, carried forward by the young women who would benefit from the doors she had opened, the barriers she had broken, and the proof she had provided that excellence knew no gender in the demanding world of military aviation. The story of Elena Viper Vasquez and her impossible landing would become legend, inspiring future generations of military aviators and serving as proof that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. The rescue had changed everything, and military aviation would never be the same. Years later, when Elena Vasquez had retired from active duty and was working as a civilian flight instructor, she would often be asked about the rescue that had made her famous. Students would want to know about the technical aspects of the mission, the challenges of mountain flying, the decisions that had made the impossible landing possible. But Alina would always redirect the conversation to the broader lessons of the rescue, that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, that skill and determination mattered more than artificial limitations, that the sky recognized only competence and courage. The rescue had been about more than just bringing two Americans home alive. It had been about proving that the barriers limiting opportunities for female pilots in combat roles were based on assumption rather than reality. The impossible landing had become possible through years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible. But more than that, it had become proof that excellence knew no gender in the demanding world of military aviation. Alina's story would continue to inspire young women entering military aviation, serving as proof that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. The rescue had changed everything, and military aviation would never be the same. The legacy of Elena Viper Vasquez would live on in the careers of the women who followed in her contrails, in the changed attitudes toward female pilots in combat roles, and in the understanding that excellence knew no gender in the unforgiving sky of military aviation. The rescue that had started with skepticism and doubt had ended with validation and respect, proving that competence and courage transcended gender, that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Elena Vasquez had not just accomplished a successful mission, she had changed the future of military aviation for all the women who would follow. The impossible landing had become possible, and military aviation would never be the same. The story of Elena Viper Vasquez would be told and retold for generations, inspiring future aviators and serving as proof that excellence knew no gender in the demanding world of military aviation. The rescue was complete, the mission successful, and the proof undeniable that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Elena Vasquez had changed everything, and her legacy would continue long after her flying days were over. In the years that followed, Elena would receive numerous awards and recognitions for her service, but she would always consider the rescue to be the defining moment of her career. It had been the mission that proved everything she had worked to demonstrate throughout her time in military aviation, that skill and determination mattered more than gender, that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected sources. The story of the rescue would be featured in books and documentaries, analyzed in military academies and flight schools, and remembered as one of the finest examples of combat rescue in recent military history. But for Elena, the real victory was the knowledge that she had changed something fundamental about military aviation, that young women entering the profession would face fewer doubts and challenges because of what had been proven that day in the mountains of Afghanistan. The impossible landing had become possible through years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible. But more than that, it had become proof that the barriers limiting opportunities for female pilots in combat roles were based on assumption rather than reality. Elena Viper Vasquez had not just rescued two American aircrew, She had changed the future of military aviation for all the women who would follow in her contrails. The rescue had proven that excellence knew no gender, that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. The mission was complete, the legacy secure, and the proof undeniable that competence and courage transcended gender in the unforgiving sky of military aviation. Elena Vasquez had changed everything, and military aviation would never be the same. The story of the rescue would continue to inspire future generations of military aviators, serving as proof that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Elena had not just accomplished a successful mission, she had changed the future of military aviation for all the women who would follow. The impossible landing had become possible, and the legacy of Elena Viper Vasquez would live on in the careers of the women who followed in her contrails, in the changed attitudes toward female pilots in combat roles, and in the understanding that excellence knew no gender in the unforgiving sky of military aviation. The rescue was complete, the mission successful, and the proof undeniable that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Elena Vasquez had changed everything, and her legacy would continue long after her flying days were over, inspiring future aviators and serving as proof that excellence knew no gender in the demanding world of military aviation. The story of Elena Viper Vasquez and her impossible landing would be told and retold for generations, a testament to the power of skill, determination, and the courage to attempt what others considered impossible. The rescue had changed everything, and military aviation would never be the same. Through the years that followed, Elena would often reflect on the rescue that had defined her career, understanding that it had been about more than just bringing two Americans home alive. It had been about proving that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, that the sky recognized only competence and courage, that the barriers limiting opportunities for female pilots in combat roles were based on assumption rather than reality. The impossible landing had become possible through years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible. But more than that, it had become proof that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Elena Viper Vasquez had not just accomplished a successful mission, she had changed the future of military aviation for all the women who would follow in her contrails. The rescue had proven that excellence knew no gender, that competence and courage transcended artificial limitations, that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. The legacy of the rescue would continue long after Elena had retired from military aviation, carried forward by the young women who would benefit from the doors she had opened, the barriers she had broken, and the proof she had provided that excellence knew no gender in the demanding world of military aviation. The story of Elena Viper Vasquez and her impossible landing would become legend, inspiring future generations of military aviators and serving as proof that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. The rescue had changed everything, and military aviation would never be the same. The mission was complete, the legacy secure, and the proof undeniable that competence and courage transcended gender in the unforgiving sky of military aviation. Elena Vasquez had changed everything, and her story would continue to inspire future aviators long after her flying days were over. The impossible landing had become possible, and the legacy of Elena Viper Vasquez would live on in the careers of the women who followed in her contrails, in the changed attitudes toward female pilots in combat roles, and in the understanding that excellence knew no gender in the unforgiving sky of military aviation. The rescue was complete, the mission successful, and the proof undeniable that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Elena Vasquez had changed everything, and her legacy would continue long after her flying days were over, inspiring future aviators and serving as proof that excellence knew no gender in the demanding world of military aviation. The story of Elena Viper Vasquez and her impossible landing would be told and retold for generations, a testament to the power of skill, determination, and the courage to attempt what others considered impossible. The rescue had changed everything, and military aviation would never be the same. In the final analysis, the rescue had been about more than just bringing two Americans home alive. It had been about proving that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, that the sky recognized only competence and courage, that the barriers limiting opportunities for female pilots in combat roles were based on assumption rather than reality. Elena Viper Vasquez had not just accomplished a successful mission. She had changed the future of military aviation for all the women who would follow in her contrails. The rescue had proven that excellence knew no gender, that competence and courage transcended artificial limitations, that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. The impossible landing had become possible through years of preparation, training, and the kind of experience that could only be gained by pushing the limits of what was possible. But more than that, it had become proof that the sky belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. The legacy of Elena Viper Vasquez would continue long after her flying days were over, inspiring future generations of military aviators and serving as proof that excellence knew no gender in the demanding world of military aviation. The rescue had changed everything, and military aviation would never be the same. The story was complete, the mission successful, and the proof undeniable that competence and courage transcended gender in the unforgiving sky of military aviation. Elena Vasquez had changed everything, and her legacy would continue to inspire future aviators long after her flying days were over. The impossible landing had become possible, and the sky would forever belong to anyone with the skill and determination to master it. Elena Viper Vasquez had proven that excellence knew no gender, and military aviation would never be the same.